Hi students, it's another lesson about subsistence strategies for cultural geography class. I went ahead and typed on this document a lot of the information I want to tell you about anyway regarding these subsistence strategies because when I try to do it in real time with this video, my screen capture software is shutting off. And so there were a couple of glitches in the other two videos that you've watched that I hope I can avoid this time around because I've typed all this on this document. And when I'm finished with this document, I will post it to our class. I think we will be using this document for another couple of videos and maybe into week 5. So you might not see it completed until week 5. So please stop the screen and write down some of this for yourself in your notes so that you like you need to be doing anyway, even when the whiteboard is behind me, because this is going to be the information for your quiz during week 4. This, the other videos, and whatever videos are after this in our week 4 folder. So we've talked about foraging, we've talked about horticulture. I went in and filled in some of this information before I made this video for you because I couldn't type it all. So please read over this. It should be what I had already mentioned to you. And if I add anything to it that comes to mind while we're discussing our next subsistence strategy, I certainly will add that before I post this to our content folder for the class. Okay, so foraging, the oldest subsistence strategy, horticulture, the next oldest subsistence strategy. About 13,000, 12,000 years ago, according to the archaeological record. And here's all the information that we covered in the previous lecture about that. And then also, I'm not sure, I don't remember whether in the previous lecture I talked about the social stratification or the social inequality conditions under horticulture societies, but there's a little bit more social inequality. Well, there's almost zero social inequality in foraging. So there's just a little bit in horticulture that we can mention. The groups, the population does get larger. So since we're in the population chapter in a horticultural society, because you are manipulating the environment, but you're not doing it with harsh chemicals, you have no artificial fertilizers, you're doing it just with all of the natural stuff that occurs in the environment. The manipulation that you're doing is not harsh to the environment. It doesn't cause erosion, or it doesn't cause nutrients to be depleted from the soil. You, in your learning process, in your upbringing, you would learn the techniques, the natural techniques that horticultural societies use in order to maintain a constant yield and productivity of the land that you use to grow the plants that is the primary source of your community's calories. So anyway, there's a type of horticulture that we talk about in anthropology class called Swidden horticulture, and some of you might have heard of it by another name that sounds extremely harsh and terrible. The other name is called slash and burn. That sounds really destructive to the environment. However, it is an extremely sustainable way of manipulating the environment where you don't use the same field over and over and over again to produce the food that your community needs. Rather, you use a piece for 2-3 years and then you leave it alone. It's called lying fallow. I'll add that vocabulary word to the horticulture section after I finish this video, but you leave the land fallow for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and you use another plot for 2 or 3 years, then you leave that, another plot for 2 or 3 years, another plot, and therefore you let naturally occurring processes repopulate that land. If you leave a piece of land fallow for 30 years, you're going to have some good sized trees on that property when you get back. Lots of grasses, weeds, flowers, animals living there, animals that have died and their carcasses have rotted, fruits that haven't been eaten and they've fallen off the trees, seeds that fall off. You've got animals defecating all over the place, bird nests, all this kind of stuff. So you've got a whole lot of natural processes that have retaken that soil. And when you get back around to it in your crop rotation, that's what crop rotation means in this particular society. As you get back around to it in your Swidden horticulture process, it might have been 30 years exists since some other generation of your social group farmed that particular land. So when you cut the trees and you burn it in place, that ash is so rich. It's a fantastic fertilizer that's very natural. Wildfires, we call them wildfires for a reason. Lightning can strike and burn down lots of acres of trees. Well, the ash that's left behind is highly nutritious for the soil, and then the males of the community work it into the soil so that it's got all the nutrients that the crops need. And while they're working this land, the rest of it that they don't need, because they're not working on a surplus. They don't need to use it all at the same time, because surplus is not in their mindset. So while they're working this other land, the trees and the animals are taking over, and all the rest of the plots of land. So horticulture is highly sustainable, highly conservative minded, but again, the conservation is probably not really in their vocabulary. Sustainable is probably in their vocabulary, because they have to sustain the land with the methods that they use, or their population doesn't continue. Okay, so there's horticulture, and let me scroll down and move on to pastoralism. Pastoralism is another ancient form of subsistence strategy, but we see it still on the earth today. Many different cultures are pastoralists, whether they are nomadic pastoralists or sedentary or transhumant pastoralists. Anyway, pastoralism has to do with the domestication of herding animals that live in a herd. So goats, sheep, yak, camels, cows, alpacas, llamas. I think I mentioned those in a video before. These animals are herding animals. They eat grasses and other things that are not edible for humans necessarily, or if we do eat them, it won't necessarily kill us, but we also won't get any nutritional value out of it. But in harsh environments of the world, when we look at where does pastoralism happen, there are lots of places in the world that have very harsh physical conditions. They're too dry, they're a desert, they're too cold, they're a tundra, they're too rocky and hilly, they're the Himalayan mountains, for instance. But people live there. But if there's too much rock, or if there's too much desert, and there's only like 1 month out of the year that's a rainy season, people can still live there. You just have to find a different way of sustaining a population with calories other than foraging, because stuff doesn't really exist in a plentiful supply to keep a population of people alive. And without horticulture, because if you don't have natural irrigation that you can rely on, your plants are going to dry up. If you don't have enough soil, if you're too high in the mountains and it's too rocky, then you don't have enough soil to sustain plants. So pastoralism is an adaptation to, you see my word here, harsh environmental conditions. And what I mean by harsh is it's too rocky, too steep, we're going to look at these two conditions a little bit later in the course. And actually, I think one of the Mr. Help videos that you saw from Mr. Sin channel, I think, has already talked about the twos that we look at, TOO, the twos that we look at in geography class, the why of where question. This is to this, to that, too much over here, and for the why human behavior happens from one place to the next. So with pastoralism, animals are your wealth, and animals are your primary food supply. Now, just like with horticulture, foraging is also going to be part of a pastoralist diet. But if you're in a harsh environment, you're not going to have plenty in your natural area in order to have a whole lot of calories coming from foraging. You might have honey that you collect. There might be fish that you can go and catch. There might be those kinds of things that are supplementary to the diet. But pastoralism is different because we have transitioned from plants being the predominant calorie sources that happen in horticulture to now we're looking at animal products as the dominant calorie sources. But there's a catch. I'm not talking about meat here necessarily, because most pastoralists don't kill their animals very often to eat the meat or the entrails or any of the other things that are part of the edible pieces of an animal. That I just said entrails, and y'all are going to look that word up and think, gross, who eats that? Well, people who rely on that animal as their primary source of calories are not going to throw that in the river for catfish bait. They're going to eat it themselves, okay? So a pastoralist has a huge knowledge about what is or is not edible, or what is or is not useful on an animal, from the hide to the antlers to the snot in their nose. And I'm not saying that to gross you out, it's just true. But obviously there's a lot of products that female bovines, in particular cows, can produce, which I'm talking about milk products, so yogurt and butter and those kinds of things. But all animals, whether female or not, can produce blood. Now, I don't want to gross you out here, but blood is a renewable resource, and you don't have to kill the animal to get it. The Maasai are my favorite example that you can look up online. You can look up bloodletting in the Maasai. There is a high degree of knowledge that is passed from elders to middle-aged to youth. There's a high degree of knowledge of how to assess an animal's health condition, how to assess whether an animal is strong enough to collect blood, how much blood you can collect without damaging the animal, how long you have to wait between cycles where you rotate back to that animal to harvest blood again. And blood, whether it is consumed raw or whether it is consumed cooked or whether it is dried into cakes or whatever it is that the society uses, however they use it, blood, when it comes out of the animal, is completely sterile. What does sterile mean? It means it's clean. No, you're not going to catch any bugs from it and die. No, you're being grossed out right now, but you're doing that to yourself, because in our minds, in our industrialized agriculture world, we think of blood as something that is gross. Or in your religious background, in Islam, for instance, blood is haram. It's forbidden. It's dirty. You have to slaughter animals in a precise way that drains all the blood, or the meat is contaminated and you can't use it. But those are other methods, other ideas that a pastoralist does not include in their habits, their norms, their customs, and traditions. So blood is a sustainable way of harvesting the calories that we need from an animal, but not killing the animal, because if you kill the animal, you lose out on the wealth that that animal gives you. As far as equality in pastoral societies, there is social inequality. There are gender roles. There's different positions for elders to take. However, there still is very little injustice associated with the gender roles. So even though there is inequality, there's not oppression, and there's not advantaged groups versus disadvantaged groups. There is a wonderful documentary on one of our library databases that I'll share with you. If you want to text me, I'll tell you what to look for. And there's a lady, a Maasai lady in that documentary, who says, I love being a woman. I love watching the kids, and girls are just as good as boys. And if you have a girl, it means your cow herd is going to increase, because when you arrange for her marriage, you will do so and swap cows. Or when you have a little boy, he'll grow up and be a warrior who's in charge of taking the cows to the water sources and taking them to food sources. And therefore they have to defend the herd and steal cows from other herds. And so children, whether they're male or female, always result in more cows, more livestock, more goats for your particular bloodline, so your wealth goes up. So children are valued for multiple reasons, elders are valued for multiple reasons, and there's not the social issues that you and I complain about all the time that come with the kind of social inequality that land ownership brings. So we'll talk about that in another lecture. See you then.